Well, I obviously feel sorry for the woman in the story, even though she's not a real woman, most likely. A story made up by the Sadducees. But there probably were women back then who maybe were in similar situations, right? In those days, women were often considered property. And if she was married to a man and had no sons, she could get passed to the brothers after her husband died. Because if she didn't have any children, specifically male ones, she was in big trouble. Because women were not allowed to work or own land or own property. So this rule about marrying the brothers seems very cruel to us to a degree, but in reality it was also kind of kind, because the woman wouldn't end up being thrown out on the street to beg after being widowed, which often happened. So the intention of this rule was originally good, but it turns out that as times change, it is not so great in the long run. So this makes me sad as a modern woman, because we don't tend to think like this anymore. At least we shouldn't anyway. We don't pass women around like property, and there are many alternatives in life to having children. And if you think about it, it actually is quite disturbing how recently things started to change. And we still have a long way to go, but this is not a sermon about gender inequality. That would take much longer. The Sadducees are testing Jesus. They don't believe in the resurrection while the Pharisees do. This is actually the only time we hear from Sadducees in the gospel. This is a different group questioning Jesus than we usually have. Even back then they didn't agree, but they agreed they didn't like Jesus. And they're being a little sarcastic. Who's going to be married to this woman in the resurrection? But since they don't believe in the resurrection, it's kind of a pointless question. They're just trying to set a little trap. But Jesus' answer is very clear, and he says, no one. Children of the resurrection will not marry or be given in marriage. The woman is going to be free to be her own person. If I was in her situation, I probably wouldn't be very happy in my life. So why should she be stuck being unhappy in the afterlife as well? Is Jesus saying that we're not going to see our spouses or our loved ones again in the resurrection? No, I don't think he's saying that either. He doesn't say that we're not going to see our loved ones again. He is saying that life in the resurrection will not be marked by the same features as our lives now. That's the point. Life in the resurrection is different. It's not just our same life extended into the next one. It's a new life. So in the afterlife, or the resurrection, or the kingdom, or heaven, or whatever you want to use whatever word you want to use for it, is not going to be the same thing. That's the Sadducees' error in their question. They would be correct if God were bound by our earthly constraints, but God is not bound. God is more than what we can imagine God to be. We're the ones who make these rules and put little boxes around God, but God can do anything. So what do we want resurrection to be like? That's a good question to ponder on your own. Are you content with everything in this life completely satisfied as it is? If so, great. I know that I know of things I'd like to have be different. I'm sure many of us have things we'd like different. But in the text, the people testing Jesus are satisfied with the luxuries of their lives. But not everyone is so fortunate, like the hypothetical woman. So it behooves them that the afterlife would be the same, right? Because they would get to keep all their same luxuries. But honestly, none of us really has any idea what the resurrection is going to look like. I mean, at some point we all come to the end of our understanding, and we just have to be comfortable with not knowing for certain. And that's part of faith, right? But what we do know is we have a promise from Jesus in the text today that the resurrection will be different and it will be better than our lives now. So the key to the text today is the last line. Now he is God not of the dead but of the living, for to him all of them are alive. So God is a God of the living. Sometimes we can detach our faiths from our everyday life and only focus on the next thing, right? And then sometimes we forget how we're supposed to treat other people. But God is a God of the living. Emerson Powery writes this week, quote, "Resurrection's children ought to be God's children and live as if their relationships can expand, becoming like God's messengers in the world, living in God's service. When one looks at the present life through the lens of the next life, the present world looks different, and old beliefs may not apply." End quote. So it is good to think about what comes next, but we have to always be applying our scriptures and our faith to our lives now. That is the main part of our calling. And I think part of the message today is that change is an inevitable thing, right? Clinging to old ways just for the sake of it will not help us in the future, and it ends up hurting people in the world, a world that is ever changing and evolving, right? The Sadducees, they like everything the way it is because they're on top. So they have clung to the rules so hard. Maybe they forgot the point of the rule was to protect the people less fortunate. Cameron Howard writes, quote, "God is a God of the living, and the living are hungry, thirsty, exploited, homeless, abused, overworked, out of work, lonely, despairing, addicted. They're right here in the pews and they're in the street outside the church door." End quote. This stuff is all happening now. And we are called as God's mission to act in the now as well. Because things do change. And it's good to look at the past and keep what works, but we can't keep everything. Not everything works for everyone, right? And God is not bound by our human laws and ways of thinking, no matter how much we try to put God in a box. If we think about and imagine the perfect resurrection, I imagine total freedom, peace, equality, and kindness shown by everybody. These are actually kind of attainable goals in our lives now, right? Then we try to make that happen now. What is our perfect resurrection? And then how can we make it happen now? What are old ways that maybe we hold on to that hinder us or help us? That is what Jesus is talking about, I think, when he says that God is a God of the living. Let us always keep the past in our hearts, but continue to look forward to a better future, not only just in the after, whatever that's going to be, but in the kingdom on earth here and now. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.